All right, welcome back to our church history class. We're on chapter 14 now, and we're looking at the church in the modern world. So this final piece of about the last 100 years or so is going to kind of be broken up into two chapters, chapter 14 and 15. So this is part one, the church in the modern world. And we're going to, it's neat that we start to obviously get really close to our own time here, and maybe some of the stuff that you've heard about, but from the recent past, but maybe you're not totally sure about. So hopefully this will be a really helpful little look at more recent history. Okay, so as we were saying in the last class, right, the area of land that the Pope is the king of, right, had actually shrunk to nothing in 1870 when the Italian forces invade, right? It went from this huge, he had large swaths of Europe, the Pope was king, right, to over the course of a couple hundred years, shrinks to nothing in 1870 when the Italian army invades Vatican City and actually takes the last little bit of chunk of land from the Pope. And the Pope actually has no land that he's in charge of. Again, as we said last class, about 50 years later in 1929, the Italian government gives back to the Pope just Vatican City State, which is, again, like a really small piece of land there. It's mostly St. Peter's Basilica. You're talking about a couple square miles there, essentially. And so the reason this is important is this has allowed, over the last 150 years, the Pope to become a much more of a spiritual leader as opposed to having to worry about being a king, right? Having to worry about land and governance and all that stuff. Now all the Pope has to do is make sure that the budget balances for Vatican City State, okay? Which is not, it's like it's just a really small little city. I think a couple hundred people live there, mostly nuns and priests. Okay, so again, we're talking about virtually nothing. So the Pope's focus now for the last 150 years has just been on spiritual leadership of the world and being able to do that. So that's really great. Because again, as we said last chapter, we see all of this stuff starting to come out that really requires spiritual leadership from the Pope. And we don't need a guy worrying about, kings and being a king of a big piece of territory or anything along those lines. It's thanks be to God, that stuff is taken away from the church so that the Pope can worry about and really step to the front and start leading the world through all this stuff that we're going to see that's unleashed on the world in the 1900s up to our own day. The first Pope that really gets a crack at dealing with this stuff, again, when 1870, when the army of Italy invades and takes away the last of the papal authority there in terms of governing, Pope Leo XIII is the first Pope, and he is a beast. In a great way. He's an awesome pontiff because he does so much in terms of starting to lead and address this industrial revolution, these new realities, these new politics and new ways of structuring societies that have all just kind of exploded onto the scene and have caused huge changes, right? Not all of them bad, of course, but just still huge changes. And a lot of people have questions. What does the church say in response to this? How do we think of ourselves as Catholics in this new world that's coming around? Pope Leo XIII just steps in and just starts leading with all of this with his Catholic social teaching, which we'll get to in a second. Some of the major issues that Pope Leo XIII has to confront. One of them is, we would call it secular humanism, which we talked about last class as well. Secular meaning like non-religious, so apart from religion, so away from Christianity. So humanism meaning this way for humanity to flourish. So secular humanism is saying, look, we can flourish as humanity by being away from religion, right? By being away from religion. And the problem with that, again, is it cuts off all the good things about, that flow from religion, that flow from our Catholic teaching about the dignity of every person, rights for people, and all those kinds of things. Secular humanism says, it says, let's take all that good stuff, but let's get rid of the religion piece. Let's get rid of the Christianity. It seeks to build a better world through our own intellects and reason, but without God. Okay? Now, it tries to take all that is good of Christianity without the Christianity that inspires and gives everything its definitions and purpose. So, right, it's Christianity that comes up with all this stuff. They try to take the good stuff and leave Christianity behind, but you can't. As an example of this is like I drive around and I see these signs that say, be kind. Right? And everyone's like, well, be kind, just be kind. We don't need to talk about, I'm not saying everybody that has that sign in their yard is, they're not all saying, we need to get rid of God. But sometimes you get this belief in our culture today that people are just saying, like, just be kind, just be nice to everybody, treat everybody equal, everybody has rights. But they want to get rid of God, right? Well, the question quickly becomes, well, be kind, well, why? Why should I be kind? Why not be selfish, right? And then people are like, oh, well, selfish is bad. Well, why is it bad, right? You got to use Christianity to say why selfishness is bad. And you have to use Christianity to say why we should be kind. We should be kind because everybody's created in the image and likeness of God and has equal value before God, right? So very quickly, things fall apart, right? If you say things like, don't judge, but then you get rid of God, well, then pretty quickly you start adding exceptions. And then now it's not really, you're not doing, you're judging, right? I mean, you're adding all the, you could take that principle to anything, right? Be kind. Well, you pretty quickly start coming up with exceptions of when I shouldn't be kind and who I shouldn't be kind to once you get away from Christianity. And then you're not being kind anymore, right? So you got to keep the Christianity piece. You got to keep the God piece if you want the fruits to really flourish. Otherwise, they're going to die because they get separated from the vine. Okay? So Pope Leo XIII comes on the scene in the secular humanism that is in the air is something that needs to be addressed. He also has to confront what we would call Darwinism. Now, this is really important. We've talked about Darwin in the scientific revolution. The church has no problem with the science of Darwin, right? There's a lot of great science in that. But there began to be this school of thought of Darwinism, which kind of takes the science of Darwin, but then begins to use it to say things about God and to make claims and statements about things beyond the realm of science, right? Like, oh, well, see, because when you look at Darwin's science, you can prove God doesn't exist. No, you can never prove God doesn't exist because we're saying as Christians that God is beyond that which is observable and provable. And so you can't say with evidence in science that this proves there's no God, right? But many people started doing that, and that exists in our own day as well. See, they'll say, look, Darwin's science proves there's no God, which of course can't happen. But we begin to get this almost kind of this religion that springs up around the science, the good science of Darwin, and that has to be confronted by Pope Leo XIII. We also see Marxism springing up, which is this political philosophy put forward by Karl Marx. Right? So we have liberalism. We talked about that political philosophy and kind of democracy and those kinds of things. Marxism really is a different take on it. It's saying the working class is going to, the people that have been ground down by the Industrial Revolution are not getting a fair wage, are being persecuted and taken advantage of. They are eventually, according to Marx, going to rise up and crush everyone and put in a new form of government, and he's advocating that new form of government is communism, kind of treating everybody as equal and getting rid of religion. So it's a very atheistic religion or political way of structuring things, Marxism, communism. Okay, so Leo XIII has a lot to deal with and a lot to address here when he comes into his papacy. Now, he starts this process in 1870 or so during his papacy that becomes, over the last 150 years, one of the most impressive and amazing and awesome things about Catholicism, which is what we call Catholic social teaching. Okay? When we talk about Catholic social teaching, what we mean is a body of work over the course of 150 years or so, put forth by many popes, starting with Leo XIII, saying this, in response to these new ways of structuring societies, in response to liberalism, in response to these revolutions that are taking place in America and France, in response to communism, okay? There's all these things, all these new ways and questions that societies are facing and wrestling with. How do we structure ourselves? Catholic social teaching is then the church putting forward and saying through letters and documents in different times, different places, this is what the church is saying about societies. If your society wants to flourish, Catholic social teaching is the teachings of the church, where the church is saying to these new societies and new questions, this is how to understand these things. This is how to approach these things. This is how to set them up. Okay? The church doesn't doesn't come to America and say, look, this is how you have to write your Constitution. Right? The church doesn't say there's only one right way to set up a society. Right? But the church has a body of teaching, and in fact, it's been collected into a book where, again, with all these different places called the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching. This was it's too much to mention here. The collection of Catholic Social Teaching is 500 pages, okay? And there's a lot of stuff because it's 150 years of writings and teachings by the church. I spent my first couple of years as a priest spending an entire semester teaching this to seniors. We talked about Catholic social teaching all semester, right? But basically, the major principles, if you could kind of boil it down into a paragraph, which is insane to try to do that, but just for the sake of that, of brevity here, the major principles that Catholic social teaching, starting with Leo XIII, puts forward is, first of all, the dignity of every person, right? And again, that's a radical notion that's not found in any other places, okay? It's the Catholic Church that teaches that every human person has equal dignity. Every person, right? Why? Because they're made in the image and likeness of God, okay? So that's a huge one. That's the very foundational principle of Catholic social teaching. The rest of the stuff flows out of that every single person has equal dignity. Other issues or other foundational principles of Catholic social teaching, the right to work. The church says everybody has a right to work and to a just wage, right? Which spoke very strongly against what was being done in the Industrial Revolution in many places. Other major principles of Catholic social teaching, we have to take care of the poor. A society has to be set up to make sure that the poor are taken care of, both by individuals and communities and also by larger organizations if necessary. Care of the environment, right? The Industrial Revolution sees great pollution and really for the first time kind of this massive, large scale pollution and people dumping things into rivers and the engines, smokestacks and all this stuff. So the church says very strongly we have to care for our environment, care for the creation that God has given to us. Some other foundational principles have to do with politics and societies and structures and governments. So the church talks about democracy and kind of puts that forward, this idea that we vote and that the people take action. Capitalism is talked about as you're probably familiar with capitalism. The church says it can be good, but it has to have good principles undergirding it and motivating it. Capitalism, if it gets unchained from that, can become very, very self-centered, very greedy, and can destroy a society. So it has to be done virtuously and rooted in truth. The church condemns outright communism and socialism because they have one of their very core things, an atheism, a getting rid of God. So the church in its Catholic social teachings really addresses communism and socialism, and again, much, much more. It's a beautiful thing. Look it up. Get short little books or little excerpts or watch videos on Catholic social teaching. Some of my classes are still up there from back when I was teaching as well. It's a really awesome stuff in the teachings of the church, and things that would surprise most people are in there. Okay. In the 1900s as well, we also see in our persecutions, and I think it's really important to know, I'm going to start down here. The 20th century, the 1900s, saw more martyrs than the other 19 centuries added up together completely and totally. So if you take from the beginning of the church to 1899, and you add all the people that got killed for the faith up, more people died from 1900 to 1999 than had died in the previous 1800 years of the church combined, right? Which is an amazing statistic, right? It's an amazing thing. A lot of times people think, they used to be persecuted in the early church by Nero and some of those early Roman emperors, but that doesn't really happen anymore. No, people are still being slaughtered and killed and martyred for the faith. A lot of times in our own day, it's happening in countries where, not first world, so we don't see it on the news all the time, where there's wars and persecutions breaking out against Catholics and Christians all the time. So it's a very deadly time even in our own century now as well, right? So in Mexico, as one example, we see in 1917, we see a new government come into place in Mexico, and it really just begins to persecute the church. And that's really what you see, right? You see these all these places around Europe and around the world, really, where when somebody comes to power that doesn't like the church, it's bad news for the church, right? And Christians get persecuted. And so that happens to Mexico. And you have this uprising eventually of the Cristeros, which were the people who said, we're going to fight back, we're going to defend our ability, our freedoms, which self-defense is something that the church says we do have a right to do. One of the famous Cristeros is the Blessed Miguel Pro, who there's a photograph of him being executed, and as he is executed, he shouts out, "Viva Cristo Rey," which kind of became the battle cry of the Cristeros, which was "Long live Christ the King." Okay? And again, think about hundreds of thousands were killed in Mexico, just in that one little pocket of persecution, which is just a staggering amount of people. And then again, a similar situation breaks out in Spain. Somebody comes into power, doesn't like the church, doesn't like Christians, and that happened in 1931. So you see these things happening, right? Of course, though. So we have these things breaking out here in Mexico and Spain, and of course we also have the communist uprising in Russia, and we have in 1917 we have World War I kicking off. But we want to look a little bit here at World War II and the rise of the Nazis, right? The church and the Nazis. A lot of times, there's a lot of confusion about this, and there's even a lot of maybe some false, some propaganda that's out there about the church and its relationship to the Nazis, as if we somehow helped the Nazis flourish, which is really just totally not true at all. Early on, as Hitler is rising to power, and people don't really totally, they're concerned, they hear his rhetoric and all this stuff, but they're not sure what exactly, he's not yet doing the things that he would eventually start doing to the Jews and other people yet. Early on, he signs a concordat, or kind of a treaty with the Vatican, granting peace to the church that's in Germany. And so there's this sense of essentially Hitler saying, look, if you sign this deal with me, this treaty with me, I will not persecute the church in Germany, I'll leave it alone. But the Nazis violate that treaty right away, right from the start. It was never honored, it was never respected. Churches and Catholics are persecuted, and things go really badly for Catholics under Nazi Germany really quickly. The Pope eventually has read from every pulpit in Germany, which I love this. The Pope says, hey, I want every Catholic church this Sunday, I want you to read this letter against Nazism. And it's called Mit brennender Sorge, which means with burning concern, which I love. The Pope just said, starts the letter with burning concern for what's happening in your country, and it just blasts the Nazis, right? So the Pope basically, anybody that has read that would not say that the church helped Hitler in any way. Okay, another thing to know too is that after the Jews, the Catholics were the second most persecuted and put to death in the concentration camps. And so again, a horrible time in history. But again, the church in many ways resisted against Adolf Hitler and what was going on. But again, we see this massive persecution right in the 1900s. So in the 1930s and 40s of Hitler's Germany, we're seeing 6 million, 10 million people put to death. In Russia, communism's putting to death tens of millions of people, including Christians. Right? We see this massive explosion of really persecution against the church in the 1900s. Particularly as these societies, particularly like communism and Nazi Germany, as these places that are really founded on a breaking from religion and in getting rid of religion, we see really what happens, how awful and how on such a large scale, how quickly things fall apart when you get rid of God. When you get rid of Christ in your society and get rid of Him as a foundational principle of what you're about, very quickly it turns disastrous, it turns into murders and violence and hatred, and we just see that over and over again. And so I think America and our own culture, we need to make sure we're paying attention and learning as people start to say, let's get rid of God, we don't need God, we can do this without God. Pretty quickly sick things start happening to societies when that happens. And we see that in Nazi Germany, we see that in communist Russia, we see that in all the places where communism starts to flourish. The church in the United States is a really interesting history, particularly in the 1900s. It really starts to become a nation of immigrants as people are leaving various areas where there's persecution or there's poverty and start coming to America. And so there was a question that these immigrants wrestled with a lot, which was how much do we keep from our old culture, and how American do we become? And that's always a tension for immigrants. And so really a lot of what you see early on is that you have all of these different Catholic churches right near each other because they were for the different, in cities, they were for the different ethnic groups, right? So you'd have a German church on one corner, and the priest would celebrate Mass in German, or at least, most of the life of the parish was conducted in German, and was German culture and all that stuff. And then maybe right across the street, you'd have the Irish church, right? And it wasn't so much that they hated each other, although there's always tensions between different groups of people. But it was just that they were coming from different cultures, right? And then you had Polish churches and you had Italian churches. They speak different languages. They're different cultures. So when they come, it's just kind of natural that they first gravitate towards each other and kind of set up their own little parishes and communities. What happens, of course, what starts to happen, and certainly has happened a lot by this point in our own day, is that the cultures eventually, while they start together, they eventually begin to bleed out and blend in with the larger American culture, right? And so we see that process playing out in these immigrant churches that when people come over to America. Now, there is a heresy of Americanism. The church actually addresses this heresy in a letter. The Pope addressed this letter and said that we do have to be careful. You see this particularly in America, where people are starting to ask for the church to change its teachings to meet whatever is going on in the larger culture. So if the larger culture is for contraception, the church should change its teaching. That's a heresy that the Pope had called Americanism, because so many people were wanting that in America. Those kinds of things, to change its teachings to reflect whatever the local communities valued. And so, again, the church has always condemned that. But as I was saying, people become more wealthy as they get settled here. They start to, again, our societies, people start to kind of move out of the cities a little bit as they become more wealthy in the 1960s. People have more money, so they kind of bleed out and blend out into the suburbs. And again, you start to have these cultures kind of mixing together and becoming more of an American versus German or Italian or Polish or whatever. We see that same process, though, happening now as we have a newer group of immigrants, that has been coming to us from Hispanic cultures, whether it's from Mexico or Central America. And so you see that same thing. You have a lot of parishes right now that might have some very heavily Hispanic, maybe several of the masses, maybe all the masses are in Spanish. If there's Spanish, the ministries and the parish and everything's kind of structured around that because they're newer. They're newer immigrants. They're still they haven't maybe had time to really get adjusted. They haven't had time to go out and kind of spread out. And so they kind of get together in this group where they know each other, they feel safe, which makes perfect sense. And again, eventually, people start to blend in with the culture around it. And so we welcome all, right? We are a nation of immigrants, and we are welcoming. The church does say that, of course, we have the right to, we don't have to let everyone in. We have the rights as nations to control, in some ways, immigration and limit those who are coming. But we do also have to err on the side of welcome, right? We have to err on the side of welcoming people and making sure that we let all those who are fleeing war and violence and all that kind of stuff in. So the church also says we have the ability to put laws in place that we can require people to follow. So anyways, a little bit about immigration. We're still living with that. That's been going on for several hundred years in our country, especially in a way that it hasn't really happened in other countries, right? We're really founded by immigration in the United States, whereas that didn't really happen in any of the other Western cultures. Okay. Our questions for today. Which pope really begins Catholic social teaching? Who is the pope that really kicks off this idea of Catholic social teaching, of kind of talking to societies in the modern world and saying these are things that you need to know about in terms of structuring your societies? Number two, what are two fundamental principles of Catholic social teaching? So I listed several of them. Just name me two of them. What are two of the fundamental principles of Catholic social teaching? Number three, what was the letter Mit Brennen der Sorge? What was the letter Mit Brennen der Sorge? And number four, what is the heresy of Americanism? Okay, what is the heresy of Americanism? That's all of our class for today. I hope and pray that you have a wonderful week and that everything's going well for you. Know of my prayers for you, and if I can ever do with anything, please let me know. Please continue to pray. Get in your Bibles. Make sure that you're praying every day, and going to church and living your faith, and in addition to learning about it here in class. Know, again, of my prayers for you. Let me know if I can ever help with anything. Take care, and God bless.